to this evening's Roski talk. We're very excited to have our guest tonight, who's going to be introduced by our student introducers. Just want to highlight for you, we're having one more Roski talk. Daniel Dean will be here on November 1st. We'd love to see them. We're also having an info session for the MFAR program that night, so spread the word if you know anyone who's interested. That's going to be in person. And Jenny, do you want to introduce the show?
Hi everyone, I'm Jenny Lynn, Director of the MFA program. Thanks for coming out tonight. We're so thrilled to hear from Vishal Jugdeo. And I wanted to also announce that Vishal's piece, The Queerum, which we're going to speak about tonight a little bit, will be on display in the MA exhibition, We Are Close in Distance, which is opening on Friday, November 4th. So mark your calendars, the opening is going to be fabulous with a poetry slam and other exciting things, and it'll be out for about a month. All right, without further ado, I will introduce the introducers, Suyan, Alice, and Hong Kong Darlene. Thank you, our MA candidates.
Hi everyone. We're going to introduce our speaker tonight, Vishal Jugdeo, born in Virginia, Canada, currently lives and works in Los Angeles, is a multidisciplinary artist and professor at UCLA, known for his films, videos, installations, and performances that employ experimental approaches to narrative. Weaving together documentary and fictional strategies, his recent works are interested in animating archives that lives in the shadows of the official record. His most recent documentary, Desert House of Lions, is a collaboration with the Delhi-based poet, researcher, and activist Vikram that documents their ongoing transoceanic practice and friendship. Shot in Delhi, Bombay, and Goa, the film sidesteps from being a conventional, quote-unquote, post-colonial documentary.
Jugdeo has exhibited widely, including screenings and exhibitions at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, Museum of Contemporary Art in Los Angeles, Commonwealth and Council Cadets San Francisco, ICA Philadelphia, Lex Art Los Angeles, and Weston from Vancouver. Exhibition works have been featured in Performa 13 New York, made in LA at Hammer Museum, also California, Biennial 2010, and Orange County Museum of Art.
He is the recipient of major grants from the Canada Council for the Arts, the Guggenheim Foundation Fellowship, California Community Foundation Fellowship, Art Matters, and residencies at the 18th Street Art Center, McDowell County, New Hampshire, Buffalo Fire Island. Jugdeo is currently faculty and new genres area head in the Department of Art at UCLA, and we're also excited to have his work part of the MA show, as we mentioned.
So please join us in welcoming our artists tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Alice and Darlene, for that introduction. I'm just going to jump right into it. I just had an image up, but I'm going to come to this work later. I sometimes like to just start talks by showing a little bit of footage. This is sort of like an outtake that's lightly edited, but I'm just going to play it and then we'll talk.
We'll talk tomorrow also while you think.
Sorry, I'm trying to get rid of the bar. Okay.
Take care. We'll talk tomorrow also while you think. Take care. Okay, cool. Bye. Take care, bye. Let me know. Bye. Bye. Bye.
What's up with mom? Oh, what? Just.
हाँ जी मुझे याद है मैं कल शाम को मेरे वापस आ रहे
Wait, what's up with mom?
Live.
What is it though? I won't say it in the film, I'm just curious for my own.
It's just every life. Working. It's okay.
It's completely out.
I can do it back again. You can see art, at least in some space for wonder.
It's fun to ignite wonder and you know,
Yeah.
and they actually have like seemingly, well, I mean it's also fun that you don't actually have to work with artists until they're exhausted of their artistic, you know, potentiality. Like you're working with artists at the peak of their, you know, artistic like and juice. But luckily I make work about life, so it requires me to constantly search for life. You know, or like, you know, the zero limit.
You know, this lovely piece by Jilan, which Jack is mostly about civils in the sector, the idea of life, and looking at how the idea of life, the category of life as a category of whatever vitality, related humanity, etc., which all came up in the late 19th century. And got solidified only around the mid-20s. It's actually quite, it's so strange that uses Bible seems so obvious, and so natural. Life seems to point to almost everything. Yes, like only around, like having the last 100 years have been figured to name what we now call life aside. When I read that piece, I was very, what do the Americans call it? Shook. This is why I still believe in intellectual endeavors.
Yeah. Me too.
They can shook you up.
They can shake you up. So I wanted to show that because one of the questions that I've been thinking about a lot in my work that will sort of reveal itself as I go through subsequent artworks is this question of like what just lives in the archive and then what actually gets made into like what we would think of as like an artwork or a film. And that tension I think is really strong in my work, or it has become really strong in my work. So I'm going to return to talking about what that clip is actually from, but I'm just going to go through some works that sort of led up to that, and hopefully it'll all circle around. So this is a work called Goods Carrier. It's from 10 years ago, 2012. It was exhibited at the Hammer Museum in the first Made in LA. It was based around a film that I shot and produced in Bombay, in India. And it was the first work that I've ever made not in the location where I live normally. So it was the first work that I made that was not shot in North America. And I thought it was a good place to sort of start this talk. So I'm going to show a short clip from that.
They're not just empty vessels for your ideas, you know. You more than anyone can read people the minute you meet them. But that
I'm not using them as empty vessels or blank slates or whatever. You never acknowledge what I've done.
It's just an observation.
This is absurd. This is an intellectual endeavor.
I'm only saying. I hope this is as much about exchange as it is about projection.
Oh, please. Why don't you enlighten me with this exchange that you think is so just and free? Come with your standards and pointing fingers. You, all people. Pick up that paper.
This is the documentation of the installation, just so you kind of get a sense. We'll talk more about it.
इन रास्तों पे खून के दाग दिखते हैं, इस इमारत की नींव मुर्दों की बदौलत है, ये नदी आंसू और पसीने से We're not so different, you know.
What do you mean?
I would like to think of us as magicians. We do this and we make a picture of the world. It's not completely made up in it, it's sort of halfway in between. You follow? He's not moving.
So this is edited together.
I think you should go to this.
Oh my God.
Or at least the ambulance.
You're serious about this?
He looks.
You're actually serious about it?
I am very serious, but he's not moving.
He won't.
Should I beat him?
No. He's not supposed to.
He's not supposed to move.
What are you talking about? This is a human being.
It's not some
Abominable snowman.
standing like a
Structure, you know.
It's very strange. Hello?
So what? Let him be.
Hello?
maybe he's haunted.
You don't think
It's
this is
vague.
whole thing is.
Listen, you know the thing is, I don't like the way he's looking at me. Okay?
He's not
I
really
just
looking at
don't
you.
like it. I just don't
Why
like
don't
the
you
way
move
he's
from
looking
that
at me.
position?
I don't like it, okay?
Just move.
Snap out of it.
So that work, those were a couple excerpts from different parts of the work. It's about 20 minutes in duration. And then it's installed in this room, which you saw bits of, that have these kinetic sort of sculptures that are timed to move in relationship with the kind of emotional and narrative flow of the work. And in the clip that I showed, what you actually see is scenes that have been scripted, that like are scripts that I wrote, and that are performed. The cast in this case was a cast of sort of mostly theater actors. Namit Das, who's the younger guy, he was actually he became more of a celebrity after we worked together, but he ended up being Raymond in the Indian version of Everybody Loves Raymond, and is quite a well-known figure. But the others are, two of the other women are theater actors, and then one had never acted before, but she danced, and it was actually her uncle's house that we somehow got permission to film in, and so we made this work. And the reason I show this is because it's important to me to kind of identify a kind of sort of turning point in my work. So, as I was saying, the first two scenes are sort of scripted, and then that last scene where they're sort of facing some unknown figure, and they've created this kind of conflict, was actually all improvised. And so when you saw the final work, it had scripted scenes and completely improvised scenes where we would just run the camera for like an hour at the end of every day of shooting, and they would sort of improvise and produce these scenarios. And I think that was like an early, because as you'll see with a couple other works that I show you, I was much more, when I started working in video, interested in constructed narratives, in things that I wrote, and in having sort of words performed. But there was always this kind of interest in something that was more freeform or improvised, or that again reflected the sort of nature of life in a different way. And so those improvised sections held some of that energy. Yeah, I'm going to talk about the next work and I'll return to some ideas from here. So this is a work from 2010 called Violet Broadcast. And it was projected on this sort of custom screen. The image is a little dark there, you can't really see, but it's sort of constructed to resemble like a billboard. And I'll just play a short, about a 2-minute clip from this, and then I'll talk about it.
A vase here, a lamp there, a coffee mug, some flowers.
I completely understand what you mean.
I mean, I feel like I'm trapped in a model of the world when I want to be out there touching it, you know? So that I can really understand it.
You don't think you can understand something without touching it?
Well, let me give you an example. I was digging a very deep hole at the bottom of this hill, just past the edge of the social world. And it had been raining for, I don't know, many years, and the water had brought all this debris down to where I was. It was a wasteland, a completely abject mess. Used condoms, depression, bags of shit, inequality, rusted nails, rotting meat, and I had schlepped all this stuff down there. Yeah, schlepped. And carried all this stuff down there.
Let me interrupt. I have no idea where this is going. I'm enjoying listening to your words, the cadence, the texture, but I'm on a sleep. I'm barely Can we take a short break?
This takes out in different directions. One thing leads to the next, not in a logical way, but certain connections make sense.
Are there torture chambers?
Yes, there are. I mean, I don't know if I would call them torture chambers. There are rooms where people, and sometimes people die as a result, but, you know, it could be impoliteness, I'm not sure.
That work, these are some frames that come of the work. It's an 8-minute piece in total, and at this time in my work, I was really interested in these kind of cyclical narrative structures. So there's, I think, 4 or 5 scenes that kind of move together, and there's a kind of a deconstruction of like tropes of television. I was really interested in certain ways in this kind of confluence of private and public sort of culture that sort of, and television was a really big, and you'll see it continues to be a really big sort of influence for me. And at the time, that the torture chamber bit, like at the time it was 2010, and I remember watching. I remember watching The View, and I think it was like Jesse Ventura was on The View talking about talking about the use of torture. And I remember just feeling this intensity where it's sort of like, it's this kind of public culture, you know, sort of like this like format, like The View, right? But then there's this intense conversation about violence and the way that, and then like immediately after they would be back to some whatever topic. And there was something to me that was really so interesting about how we were sort of absorbing culture and kind of absorbing like violences of the world or something into this kind of very, into these kind of expressions of neoliberal capitalist culture or something like that. And I think it was a really strong sort of interest in mine. So, and then, you know, as the piece goes, like, it kind of, you know, devolves. The host makes the guest, like, kiss this globe, yeah. And so, I was also, you know, I loved this, it was my ex, Billy Wright, and we were together for like 8 years, and we collaborated a lot during that period of time. And then the other two performers were like good friends of his. And at that time, you know, I had moved to Los Angeles in like 2004, this was made in 2010, and during the period of dating Billy, because he and a lot of his friends, you know, moved to LA in the 80s to like become actors. None of them still act, they mostly are writers, but it was this amazing opportunity to get to work with people that wanted to kind of play around, and I think I was always really interested in theater in different ways and performance in different ways, and so, yeah. So I'm going to show one more work from that series, and then kind of, I want to make sure that I don't go over time. This is called Stage Design for Disassociation. And I'll just jump right into it.
So Cynthia.
Yes, Patty. When did you know that it was over?
Oh, it was over way before it was over. You know how you just have like this sense about these things, like you can just you just feel it on some profound, very super real level, like exponentially real, deep down beneath the surface of like every day. I mean, it permeates your sleep, it floats somewhere between you and every person that you encounter in the day.
Yes.
Your dog, your neighbor. The glow just becomes more and intense, and at certain times you just start to develop like this connection to it, as though it were this concrete, tangible presence
Yes.
there, a thing in the world, you know?
Yes, and then it was all over. How sad. How utterly sad.
Well, come on, you know what they say about loss. Once something's gone, poof, it's just gone. But you know, it just what it does is it leaves behind this gaping hole where the thing once was.
Right. Let's play a game. Okay. Close your eyes. No, you have to close both eyes. Okay, Cynthia. Okay. Now I want you to imagine something. Okay? Are you ready?
Yes.
Okay, great. I want you to imagine that everything you've ever loved, everything you've ever fought hard to acquire or achieve, everything vanishes. What are you left with?
So this is an 11-minute work, and you know, this character breaks down, and it's this kind of like, it sort of enacts, this is other frames from the film, but it kind of moves through sort of like a televised therapy session. You know, like there's a lot of this kind of a self-help sort of language, but then there's again, these kind of questions about loss and grief that are sort of floating through and sort of like, you know, begging for more space or something. And again, this was a sort of continuation of that investigation, I think, into this kind of, into what happens in that sort of space of something like television culture or something, where there is this sort of intense confluence of the public and the private. And then, you know, I haven't said much about the installations that the work are often in relationship to, partly because I think in certain ways I've really moved beyond wishing to make installations. And I think as I continue with the talk, you'll just see I'm sort of interested in thinking about how images can move through the world in different kinds of ways. And when I was making more like installations that had really sculptural aspects, like the images really didn't move through the world, they just existed in, you know, art institutions. But that being said, I was really interested in producing these kind of environments that were somewhere between a kind of a staging and a sort of abstraction. I was interested in the ways that the language became like an object akin to the objects in the space. In this case, there would be times when there's a coffee urn like here that has a speaker embedded in it, and there's another speaker here. And so there were times when the screen goes blank and you hear the voices out in the space. I don't know. I was much more invested in kind of exploring theatricality and sort of theatrics, I think, at this stage in my work. But I'm going to move forward. This piece is called "A Shaky Picture Has No Weight," and this was a live work that was presented at Performa in New York in 2013. And just to give some sort of a refresher on like the timeline. So the first clip that I showed that was more like an outtake that was shot in 2018-19. And then the first work that I showed that was filmed in the internet was 2012. And then Violent Broadcast 2010, that last work, a stage design for this session, was 2011. Just to give a sense of like the trajectory and how the work moves where it does. So this is a couple years later. And this is when I was really developing this kind of interest in archives in a certain way, in documentary, and in place. And so the work was presented on a stage, and it was it had video projection, sound, and then there's actually live performance. So that's my ex Billy and myself are situated behind the screen, and we perform live, and we also are featured in parts of the video. And a part of, when I came up with the idea and wanted to work between liveness and the recorded image, I knew that on a stage, one would feel privileged, and so I made this decision to have the liveness only reflected forward by mirrors to kind of try to equivocate the sort of projected image with what you saw happening live. Yeah, this is just a little fragment from that.
Okay, but just relax, okay?
I'm sorry, I keep doing this thing where I get the bar and then it doesn't go away, so I'm just gonna restart. Sorry.
Okay, but just relax, okay?
Relax.
Alright, just, take a deep breath.
Okay.
And then exhale. Okay, now, I want you to close your eyes.
Okay, they're closed.
And then tell me, what do you see? What's in front of you?
Okay, so in front of me, I see a wall. And then above that is just sky. And you know how you can kind of apprehend the ocean before you even see the ocean? So I get the sense that the ocean is beyond that wall.
Because you can smell it?
It's not even that, it's just more a sense. So I walk up towards the wall. Generally, the picture is just brown. The wall is kind of a lighter brown. And then beyond it, the sand is this sort of earthy brown. And then the water itself is this kind of chocolate, dark brown. It just kind of crashes in waves onto the beach. And then the sky rises out of the ocean. It's almost like the kind of shit brown from the water is kind of rising up into the sky and cloaking the sun. But the waves are bringing with them all this debris. So there's like chicken bones and sheep carcasses And everything is spreading this kind of wide, expansive sort of field of debris. It's really quite disgusting.
Is it funny?
It is not funny.
It's okay, it's fun.
No, it's not funny.
Potato brush. Right at the edge of that. Yeah. Very potato brush. They'll say. As a result, yes. But they can see what they will know. A little the brass to the way.
Scene 2, take 7, Mark.
Action. Talk to me about these. I've been waiting all my life to hear about them. You really don't share much.
I know, but I am now. So these are these guys like waking up in the thick of the jungle. They're still basically intoxicated from last night's liquor. Everybody there is continually trying to rid themselves from having been possessed, even though most of them are kind of wealthy landowners.
I've been waiting all my life to know more, and you can be so guarded.
I know I can, and you're being very patient. I mean, I wish I could show you a clearer image. We get closer and closer, but we don't actually find the middle.
Well, your words trace infinite circles around the core, like a cocoon. It's a closed vessel, thick and impenetrable.
You know, I've always been more interested in the edges than I am in the center.
Why don't we just break it down and just be real for a minute? You keep circling around the jungle like it's a point of clarity. So the jungle is the climax.
Yeah, we could say the jungle is the climax, and the boys in the field.
Oh, boys in the field, climax, please.
No, you haven't even seen the images. They're really not that scintillating.
At that work, it's about 35 minutes in duration, the full live work. And the footage that feels like documentary footage is shot in Guyana, South America, which is where my parents were born and the last several generations of my family are from. And there is a thread in my work that traces, in a sense, and I'm still developing it, but that traces this kind of passage, right, that my ancestors took from India, starting around 1838, I think was the first ship, and it was following the abolition of slavery in the British colony, right? So my parents' ancestors went as indentured laborers to work in the sugar plantations. They were taken by the East India Company, which was, the British colony, right? And so between a phase of like 1838 to about 1917, there were about 500,000 Indians that went as indentured servants. And it's a complex history that's actually obviously been documented in certain ways, but it is what I like to think of as this kind of like shadow archive, like one that has not really, a lot of people don't know about that history or the history of indenture in general, which took people to not only the Caribbean, so Guyana is considered a part of the Caribbean, but to places like Fiji and Mauritius. And so it's been a kind of a question that I've been thinking about a lot in my work. So this was the first work where I traveled to Guyana. And I found that trip so traumatizing in so many different ways. There's a lot of just sort of historical, cultural trauma throughout. There's also, because of the colonial period and the way, I'll get into it, but there's also an intense ethno-racial tension that produces violence actually quite regularly. And so it's a very complicated space. This work begins to touch on certain histories, but it was from 10 years ago, and I honestly did not know what to do with it, and I kind of ran away from it. And so I'm just going to jump to this next body of work, and then I'm going to try to end with enough time that we have a really good question and answer section. So a couple years after making that work for Performa that was shot in Guyana, in certain ways I was like started to open this vault, right, into not only like family history, but also a kind of, it was like that work in Guyana was going to require so much of an education for myself around political history and social history, and I actually at that point sort of really felt like I'm at such a loss for being an artist and not like a social scientist. I don't even know how to approach this. But a couple years later, I went back to India with the interest in making another work. And all of those theater actors in that first work were straight. And I really wanted to work with, collaborate with queer folk in India. And just by chance, I was introduced to this person who's the Queerum. That image is from January 2016. And we've worked together ever since then. It's been a long-term collaboration. The Queerum is a poet, an activist, and a teacher based in Delhi. We have just sort of built a kind of a co-authorship and an ongoing collaboration. And so you meet the Queerum in that first clip that I showed tonight. I'm going to show just a short fragment from the first work that we made together, which is titled The Queerum, and it'll be in the show, in the Roski show that opens in early November.
It's beautiful. You're going to like this document in 20 years. You'll be like, all right.
Who's living for 20 years?
Who's living for 20 years? How many years?
3 more, 30.
3 more.
30, that's it, yeah. Wrap it up. Start a new 30s club.
Well, you better get working on your dissertation.
That will also. And if not, I don't really care.
Really?
Yeah.
You don't have any sense of wanting to leave anything in history?
Oh God, no.
Really?
Yeah, I hate the whole idea of leaving seeds of yourself behind. It's so masculine.
So you think that a kind of ephemerality or something is that you aspire to that, and it's the most ephemeral.
As much as I could be, I'm sure I've left footprints on the ecology, I've done all of those things, so I have left some sort of spectral presence, of course.
We were talking yesterday about aging.
Yeah.
I mean, so you do think about it.
Yeah. Also because I see people around me who were young and queer at one point and are not anymore. And they're alone. I mean, my mother's one of those people as well. I think she was queer in some sense. She lived her life as a single woman, raised 2 kids. She fought out structures of class, of patriarchy, and various other, of sexuality, etc. in her own way. And so I think all of these people who are single, alone, etc., and not necessarily with networks around them of even queer kinship that will sustain them. There is no infrastructure for sustainable queer kinships. It's not so much that people don't imagine other kinds of relationships. It's not that they don't have any. I think what sustains a lot of people in at least this city are friendships that just happen, queer or not. But how do they sustain themselves? How do they last? How do they find more meaning than simply being around for each other, and especially in times of crises? How do you sort of build up from there instead of just sort of holding fragmented pieces together? How do you build? If queerness is about precarity, it's precarity of various kinds. It's not just patriarchy, it's neoliberalism, it's caste, it's lack of families, it's all of those things. And so, yeah, why am I looking so much different?
So that work, we shot it in 2016. I made it into this film. It's actually, I continue to work on that film because I've never been happy with it as a document. And so some of the other footage, not of the queer speaking, but some of the other footage that's cut in is from this kind of quite massive archive that we produced together at this point. Which includes, that archive includes like that sort of outtake that I showed earlier. And as we continue to work together over the years, other members of the queerness community sort of entered the frame. So that's Dine or Issa, who they were housemates at the time. So this was shot in, that image is from 2019, January 2019. And Dine ends up becoming a major character in the next sort of iteration that we produced together, which was called Does Your House Have Lions, which is a film that was completed in 2021, last year. And so I'm going to just show a part of that because it... I'm going to skip through because hopefully some of you all, I know I sent the link to the seminar class. It's kind of better if you can watch the entire film, and I wanted to cut it short because I do want to talk about my current project, and I know we're getting close to time. How do I encapsulate this? I mean, it's a 49-minute film, and what you end up sort of experiencing and what we realized as we were capturing, like, over all the years, was this kind of, this growth of the encroachment of fascism into the lives of these people that I had this amazing opportunity to spend time with, befriend and document. And so, under the kind of cover of the pandemic lockdown, so those last two scenes that you just saw, in December 2019, I had visited India, and 2019 was when Modi gained his second term, right? And if a fascist is democratically elected, it will always be their second term that you'll really see them become a fascist. And so that was when the Modi government kind of violated the terms of their agreement with Kashmir. And then in December, they started, and I'm sure you've heard of this in the news, the Citizenship Amendment Act, which was the first legal evidence that Modi's, BJP party actually was going to start enacting Islamophobia within the law, right? Because the Citizenship Amendment Act allowed for refugees coming from all of South Asia into India other than Muslims, and so it was the first time that enacted in law there was something that separated Muslim folk out, right? And Muslims are a massive part of India's population. And so these two women lived in the household with the Quirum and Dine, and they're organizers, they're activists. You meet them at a certain part in the film. And then, the Citizenship Amendment Act, which was sort of announced in like December 2019. I arrived in India, I think like December 10th or something. And the whole country, there was a wave of sort of protests. There was like a people's movement starting to grow, right, in response to the Citizenship Amendment Act. That sort of movement in various ways continued through until February 2020, just before the pandemic. And when there was something that, if you look on Wikipedia, it's called the Delhi riots. But what it was that there was a violent sort of a kind of clash that took place at one of these non-violent women's sit-ins in the northeast of Delhi. And these two women, Natasha Narwal and Devangana Kalita, left and right, were major organizers and activists. Under the kind of cover of the lockdown, which you also might have heard in the news, was total chaos. Like the government announced a lockdown and in like 12 hours it happened, and that meant all of the transportation and sort of ended, which meant that hundreds of thousands of migrant workers from cities like Delhi walked by foot to return to their villages because they didn't have work and they didn't know what was going on. It was a pandemic, and tons of people died. It was sort of but what everyone, all the activists would say is that the lockdown was actually to stop this movement. So these two women, warrants for their arrest come immediately when the lockdown occurs. Then by like May 2020, they're arrested, they become incarcerated, and so then we're sort of fully in crisis, right? And so that film, the final footage ends October 2020, when the household's still in crisis. These girls were incarcerated for 14 months. They were released on bail July 2021, but they're still on like major surveillance. They can't get employment, they can't get housing. These are just some images from the film. So that's basically what, if you have an opportunity to watch this, Does Your House Have Lions, it kind of tells that story. But it doesn't try to educate anyone, I think, about the political history, but it really sort of stays focused on the household itself. It's a portrait, I think, of a household. Now we're running low on time at 7:54. Maybe I'll just...
It's okay.
Yeah?
Yeah, you're good.
Cool, okay, cool. So the current project is called Caribbean Television. It's very much in progress. So what happened with that previous project, Does Your House Have Lions, and then the Queerum? It's ongoing. We continue to work together. The Queerums, so the film, we made this film. We decided to release it online in April 2021, partly to kind of bring awareness to this idea that like thousands of activists have been incarcerated by the government. Like there's no freedom of speech in India. Like, you know, it's kind of, they're really in crisis, and their household is in crisis. So we released the film partly because I said, what do I do? Like I didn't set out to make this very political work, and now I'm sitting on this archive of all of this kind of evidence, right? And the Queerum in like fall 2020 said, well, at this point we just actually need to like get the word out in a sort of way. So we assembled the film, we released it online. It was still during pandemic time, so April 2021. Mocha LA released it on their stream platform online, partly because I also wanted it to be able to have a kind of global reach. So it released April 1st. By like April 8th, the Delta wave sort of swept through Delhi. The whole household got COVID, of course. The Queerum's mom got COVID. Since then, the Queerum's mom's COVID the Queerum's mom has like long COVID. It developed into epilepsy. Basically, they're just like in total crisis. The household, once the girls came back, split up. They are in crisis. We're trying to figure out how to continue working. It's obviously at this point, it doesn't make sense to continue making some kind of a documentary. It's like things are just too real. But we have a standing project to make a fictional work, actually, and we're continuing to build the archive. We wrote an essay this summer together, and we're just in the formation of this thing called like the Lions Collective. We haven't totally named it yet, but we're looking to publish, use some of the resources that have come out of the film to sort of to publish, Dalit and queer work that comes out of India. And then also, it's sort of linking into this new project, which I've returned to Guyana. I was there for a month in September. I'll be back for a month in December, and I'm building this kind of new archive that actually links certain things between India and Guyana in really interesting and specific ways that I'm just kind of learning about. It's kind of blowing my mind. So this is taken from the rice land that my great-great-grandfather acquired. So when folks were enlisted into indenture, right, from India, from the villages, from the rural communities in India, they had to come to Guyana, work on the sugar estates for a term of 5 years, after which time they could return to India, or if they decided to stay in Guyana, they were given a very good deal by the British government, which was not given to the freed slaves, right, that came out of the abolition of slavery. So Indians were able to acquire a patch of land, and my great-great-grandfather was amongst the more enterprising that sort of was like built that into quite a large amount of land, and he became a rice farmer. This is all rice land in Guyana. In 2021, like so we live in a hellscape, like I think in general, but in 2021, because when the Dutch colonized Guyana, it's thick Amazon jungle, it's on the northern tip of South America. They built a seawall, and so all of this is actually under sea level. All the farming space, the only way that they could cultivate the land to grow sugar was to actually, change these kind of coastal wetlands into cultivated land. Of course, climate catastrophe now means that this whole area gets flooded. So in 2021, you wouldn't see any green here. It would be like a sea with some houses and plants, trees popping out of it, and that lasted for 6 months. So basically, all of the rice industry, all of the sugar, because basically all of that is now owned by Black or Indian folks that over time have sort of figured out how to kind of keep their land and cultivate it. The rest, if you go just upriver, just a mile to the left there, it's just thick Amazon jungle. So in a sense, Guyana's on this total tipping point. Also because ExxonMobil discovered the largest deposit of oil off the coast. So that sea that I'm describing, with that seawall and the brown water, there's the largest deposit of oil in the world found just off the coast. ExxonMobil has struck an amazing deal with the government where they get 98% of profit and Guyana gets 2%. And of course, it's a totally corrupt political system, so all that just goes into the politicians' hands. So I have started now working with, this is my uncle Deo, estranged uncle, actually, who was very involved with the Black Liberation movement, and we are sort of beginning to record parts of his story. This is Nazima Raghubir, who is a journalist and is working on sort of this resuscitative like archival projects with different communities around Guyana. And I'm just going to play a few minutes of this. I just cut this together from the footage I shot in September just to be able to like apply for like grant funding, and then I'll talk a little bit about this project and we'll go to questions. Sorry, I do this thing. So just let me start.
That's where the money, they put the money in a wheelbarrow, and they brought it to the village, Victoria.
The thing that I don't understand is how did the freed slaves accumulate wealth?
An academic will know.
Yeah. I'm sure Victor would know.
Victor,
Okay.
I sure might know, yes. This is some of our knowledge, right? About your great-grandfather. This is her workers. You see, on the sum, $10. This is what she used to earn in 1965. $10 Chinese. Poor rich people in dollars and chicken. Yeah. Nothing has changed. The only thing is the numbers, the nuts.
He has questions about his grandfather, and in a way they were both ruthless men in some way. Right? But as a result, they have made us all able to survive in different ways, but able to survive.
Yeah. No, live. Sufferers have to survive. We live.
Yeah.
That privilege, this has always been my, like yourself, how did this thing happen? And I'm blessed with this connection that we're making here now. Because I would say 100% this is true, but it has to be told. You're looking for something, right? I feel it's there because it's big about East Indians online. It's big. We had the stairs going to Camp Street. My dad says that if we were rushed, like they say that people rush into the place, he would burn the stairs. Okay, so we had 2 plastic bottles of gasoline. So if you were being rushed, it was right there. When it was lunch in the book, somebody said, you were trying to find the world. You could go to any place. Why did you choose get out? He says, when he arrived in Vietnam, he thought he walked into a movie.
Absolutely.
It's a whole fucking place, it's a movie. Absolutely. You should go to that Starbucks market on a Friday night. It's pure action.
To end up, investing in that more. There are also people who are back in India who sold their land. So the stalls inside of many times sold like dry goods. There were used to be some old bookshops in here. I usually stop at this eatery.
You're cool, Noah. Do you think you're one of the few people doing the work you do?
I mean, as in journalism?
Seems like you're also just building an archive of some sort.
I'm not the only person. I feel that there are other people who are doing it, but not so publicly. Also, they're doing it in their own ways. I don't know what they've done with the information as yet. I do spend a lot of my time, a ridiculous amount of time, acquiring books on the days.
I'm just going to stop there and just talk for 1 minute and then go questions. Sorry, I had a few extra images, but anyway, I'll just open an image. So one of the threads of this work is, last week actually, that there's a legal nonprofit in Guyana that's actually handled all of the landmark cases around sort of LGBT sort of law because there's still colonial laws, for example, like the anti-buggery law or like the anti-cross-dressing law. And so this nonprofit called SASOD, S-A-S-O-D, Guyana actually has handled, they've been around for 20 years, and they handle these cases, and they have to figure out ways to build the cases around a very homophobic society, right, like all of the Caribbean. And so Guyana, in certain ways, has actually led the Caribbean in terms of making sort of, in terms of advances in terms of human rights laws in relationship to LGBTQ stuff. So the founder of that sort of organization called me last week and was like, "Will you help me make a film?" Because I want to document basically how the trans law and all of the various kind of like organizations that have sort of come around the trans community have been sort of building, this kind of case. And so, so now there's this funny thing where I'm kind of like, well, like I would actually really love the queerness help because the queerness has been studying a lot of law in India. Of course, they're different contexts, but just in terms of making a film, like I wouldn't want to go in as a filmmaker in that context without the help, particularly of a trans person. But so now we're sort of like this Lions collective that we're sort of forming is kind of thinking about different ways that different infrastructures can kind of support different types of both archival projects and then also in this case, like again, it sort of functions more like a political project. So I'm going to end it there and take questions because I know that was a lot that I gave you. So.
Questions?
I have a small question, Vish.
Yeah.
What does Vikram teach when you said that they teach?
So yeah, they've actually been teaching in it's like a law school actually, and they're teaching. They teach like sort of gender studies and queer studies in the context of a law school, which is kind of amazing. So when I asked that question, like, you better finish your dissertation, they did not finish that, so they're sort of in an issue. They dropped out, and so they're having a really hard time finding a proper, like, job. So they'll get hired for, like, one-off classes, and that's, yeah. So when we met, they were teaching political science, and then, yeah, they taught a lot of sort of gender and sexuality stuff. But now, I think it's really amazing that they're working in the context of law school, because that's kind of like where everything happens, right, in terms of like trans or queer rights, particularly in the context like India. Yeah.
I'm interested in your research process for documenting the politics in India, because I know particularly in India there's a huge media bias problem. So how do you navigate that, and what type of sources are you using?
What was the last part of the question?
What type of sources are you using in researching politics in India?
Yeah, I mean, again, like I said that thing about, like, wishing in certain ways that I was trained as a social scientist. Like, in a way, like my method has always just been like friendship and connections, right? So it's sort of like that's what I'm doing. It's just sort of building friendship with people that are. I'm not like leaving them the task of educating me, but we're like together, sort of like figuring out how to like investigate things, right? And sort of like almost taking their lead and using the skills that I have, which are artistic skills, right? Like to kind of take their lead and then follow a thread, right? But in terms of that question of the media bias, like totally, I mean, there's there's just not journalistic freedom. And the journalists that are, like I follow this person, Rana Ayub, that writes often for the Washington Post, that's been one of the clearest voices, Rana Ayub, I think it's A-Y-Y-U-B, writes for the Washington Post, and she's been one of the clearest voices, right, covering the Modi regime, and like with a very critical voice, and is like in hiding, I think, in Goa now. Like it's kind of, it's like, so, yeah, does that kind of answer it? Yeah. Hi.
Hi. So I have a question about your filming process. Like, I mentioned that some like scenes, like recognizing the landscapes and stuff.
that you're building this archive, like how do you how you think about shooting them? So yeah, and with like the queer and the starry, and like that would like if you talk a little bit more about that.
But what do you mean in terms of a pyramid of star?
Like the way that you're framing your shots, like how you decide your location, how you decide your angles, because you're doing a documentary style.
Right, yeah. I mean, I think like we've actually been shooting much less in public spaces. Like most of Does Your House Have Lines was just shot in sort of domestic spaces because, especially shooting with Vikram, like she gets enough attention as a trans person, then you add a camera and it's just kind of like, this is just a little much. But so in terms of where we shoot, I don't think that there's ever been an interest in necessarily like documenting that place, and that's why when you see Does Your House Have Lions, you actually don't really see very much context. Like my editor was so annoyed with me. She's like, why didn't you shoot pickup shots or something so that I could cut away? And I was like, I just didn't want to, like you see that there's moments where we film some people and we try to be really mindful about not showing identities really and like trying to be kind of a little bit more ethical rather than just pointing cameras, around the plate. Does that sort of answer the question?
Yeah, I'm just curious about like process of like what you include and what you.
Oh, the selection process. Yeah, I mean, thank you. Yeah, thank you. I mean, thanks for that question because I think that's why I wanted to show like an outtake at the start to kind of just show that, there's so much footage that's just there, right? And so when we assembled Does Your House Have Lions, like it took so long to edit this thing, and it's the first project that I ever worked with an outside editor on because I was just like, I am lost in the woods. So, but once the storyline really revealed itself, then we kind of went back through the footage and we only tried to use footage that carried threads forward, so that there was some sort of armature that the whole thing was hanging on, and so that was the selection process. But I know there's not an easy way to say, like it's really just poring over the footage for hours. I mean, that's kind of why I wanted to show an outtake, and I had another outtake actually of my uncle that I didn't have time to show, but where I do just have to stare at things for a really long time and feel like if there's an energy in that actual footage, right? And that's sometimes hard to identify what that energy is or where it comes from. Sure.
Let the suit go first.
Okay.
I wanted to ask, I remember when you were talking about the stage time disassociation, how you no longer really are interested in using installation. I'm curious for some of the more recent projects you're showing us, how do you present those? What's your method?
Oh yeah, thank you. That's a great question. So with Does Your House Have Lions, which is the little longer form film with Vikram, I don't have an image of it. That was just, when it was shown in a gallery, it was just a large scale projection. But a big part of, and that, I mentioned it and then I wanted to kind of return to it. I'll just go to an image. With that work, I really, as I was building it, it just felt like it needed to go onto the internet, actually. Like I really wanted it to just have that kind of like dissemination. And for me, the reason for that was that it was so important that their community actually got to engage with it. And so what's cool, so what we stipulated with the film is like if it shows in a context like in an exhibition or something, I will always ask if the institution would also put it online. And then those links just get sent around like in the community in India, which is amazing. And that's when like everyone there kind of sees it. And it's been really cool. Like people will make like watercolors and stuff from like frames, and it was like pirated on YouTube, which I kind of quite like. I like didn't ask them to take it down. I was like, I'd rather having it a little bit more free. And then for the new project, like Caribbean Television, I haven't really decided that. The point that I think I wanted to make, which is sort of a point that I still, like I can't figure it out in my own self, is just like, it's this thing about art institutions, like the way that when you were a moving image maker, so many times if a film is shown in a gallery, you're accepting the fact that like some audience just comes in and watches 10 minutes and leaves, right? If it's like an hour-long film or something. And it's just, and then on the other hand, like the film circuit has never totally appealed to me, so it is this kind of in between, but I especially with these projects, I just didn't want them to feel like rooted to the physical space of like the rarefied art world or something, because the works are about people that don't come from that world, so it didn't make sense to just sort of, so, yeah. Thanks for the question. I think there was one over on this side.
Oh,
and then, okay, and then also Jennifer, but
Yeah.
sure. Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, no, yeah, go
No,
ahead.
sorry, yeah.
I can talk to you tomorrow.
Yeah, I mean, that was a question about scripted versus like archival work. As I mentioned, like we have a standing plan to write this piece together. I've always wanted to return to writing into the kind of like melodrama of those works and the kind of like the things that they were able to do with language. I lost the ability to write in the same way or something, like I still have to find it. But it's definitely an interest. I mean, I think I really want to make films now, so and I don't think that they have to be documentary. In fact, because I don't personally even really love the documentary medium. Like, I don't find myself watching that many documentaries, and, but it's sometimes like, as an artist, just like there's part of what you're able to do, just you stop being able to do it. It doesn't mean it's gone away forever. It probably just means that it's like, baking or something, or like, like simmering, and so, yeah. I definitely want to return to writing. Maybe Jennifer and then Jenny,
Sure,
Jennifer.
Okay.
Yes. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking about that. I was thinking about the first piece you made in India, which was scripted / improvisation. And I was thinking a lot about you and how you appear in your work. Whether it's the scripted pieces sometimes, and or people that you know, that you're intimate with. Whether it's your former partner or later now.
Totally.
And then just thinking, I was thinking a lot about the camera in the piece in Guyana. Like I got really, because I think in this piece I was very cognizant of the camera, because you're like going like,
totally.
you know what I mean? And so it's like, I was thinking about you being that person, like, and then she tells you, like, you got this all wrong.
Totally.
You made this big mistake. So this way that you're building, like, Chronicle of the Summer, like, building yourself into the piece. And so that just got me interested. So who the heck is your camera person in these?
Oh, that's a great question, actually. So there's often, thanks for that question. I mean, like, in Does Your House Have Lines? When you see the actual credit of when the full-length film runs, I think there's like 7 names listed for camera. What I realized with it was that I just had to keep trying different people out because, I actually really like that it's this really prismatic sort of like gaze. Like it never feels like one person's aesthetic in a way, and I wanted it to feel collective in that regard. But it was also trying to figure out, like, it was mostly friends or friends of friends that were shooting, but it was just figuring out who are these people going to feel the most comfortable around to just, Right. So there's like it started with this guy named Wency Mendez who shot a lot of stuff, but Vic Queerum and Wency knew each other from like high school, and they were always kind of bickering. They just didn't like each other, and I was like, well, that's never going to work. Even though Vic Queerum would say like, no, you should get Wency. He's like the best. He's like the best at shooting. I always liked the way the footage looked, but I was like, no, that's not going to work. And then there was this woman, Natasha, but I realized that it worked for certain points. And then we actually landed on a mutual friend who's an artist, who doesn't come out of the film world, but was an artist. And he ends up shooting with us a lot, just because Queerum is super close, and it just felt like no matter what we were talking about, it never felt like someone was sort of censoring or editing. Yeah. But then in Guyana, I just shot on my own, except at the market.
Well, that was when I became aware because they were following you at the market.
Right. Yeah. So at the market, Nazima, she has someone that she works with when she goes on research trips, and so Keisha shot that. Yeah.
Okay, I have like a really big one that maybe you can try to answer it in a small way, and then we can talk more tomorrow. And then I have a very small one, so.
Okay.
So the big one is kind of about like how you see the relationship between art and activism, and if you consider yourself an activist, or if you did, and it seems to me like maybe there was a shift in which you were able to address politics in a new way when you traveled, or maybe it was just your friendship with the queer, so I'm curious about that. And then secondly, I want to know where that title of House of Lions comes from, and your new collective, The Lions, what that's from.
Yeah, totally. I don't think I'm an activist, but I have a ton of respect for activists, and I think I think I've always been very politically engaged, and I've been really drawn to people that won't let politics leave the room. And I think that's how I like to live in the world. But I'm not an activist. When I see what the two women do, I can't do that. And I think, but I would say that in the time of being with the Queer, it's been a real political education for me as well. And it's actually been an education with me even around ideas that don't come from India, and we just sort of figured out because I realized at a certain point I have to ask what is this level of knowledge, even particularly around Black studies from the American context, right? And what we realized, or Queer knew this, I didn't realize this, was that there was a Dalit press that had published say the apartment Lose Your Mother, right? But made it accessible, at a price that anyone could purchase, 100 rupees or something like that. And so a lot of the Queerum's sort of intellectual, sort of becoming actually came through this one press that was publishing these incredible texts like Tina Camp and things like that. And so if I'm planning a class, I would call it the Queer. I'm I can help you. I need a little help, And so then the question about does your house have lions? So a few days before the film, I was we don't have a title, and I was you need to help me. And they suggested this Sonia Sanchez book of poems, a book of poetry called Does Your House Have Lions? And in the book of poems, the very first page is actually taken from the liner notes of a Rahsaan Roland Kirk anthology album, and it's an anecdote where, I'm just going to paraphrase it because I don't have it with me, but it's an anecdote where Rahsaan Roland Kirk's producer Joel Dorn has just bought a house, and he says to Rahsaan, I just bought a house today. And Rahsaan says, did you buy a house with lions? Get yourself a house with lions. Outside of a museum or a church, or not a church, a museum or a school. You need a house with lions. And so, but the Sonia Sanchez book was the only reference that the Queerum knew. The Queerum read that text, but didn't really, the dedication of that book is Sonia Sanchez writes to all my sisters who lost their brothers to HIV and AIDS. And so when we saw it, and also the way that she just reprints this anecdote from the liner notes of Rahsaan Roland Kirk, it felt like the lesson was take a title, borrow it, use it. Right, because she's doing it, she's sort of showing that lesson, and then because it was about these sort of groups of artists that were sort of influencing each other even just through title, it felt like it made sense for us, And then I think at the time, it was sort of we refer to it in this essay we wrote this summer as a queer object, right? The lions themselves are this queer object because they are an object that could be metaphoric, it could be physical, it could be all of these different things. And I think at the time, I just liked the idea of this talismanic, sort of shield of protection around this house that was really in crisis, And then the question about the Lions Collective, I don't know that that's what we're going to call it. But we are building a kind of a collective structure and trying to figure out how that makes sense. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Yeah.